Hello everyone and welcome to another casual review. Today I'm talking about Final Fantasy XVI. Like most modern Final Fantasy games, this is an action RPG rather than the traditional turn-based RPGs that Final Fantasy used to be known of. It is, however, a return to the typical high fantasy setting rather than the more science fiction fantasy setting that Final Fantasy tends to lean towards nowadays. And I'm actually kind of here for it because I actually prefer the more medieval high fantasy setting. You assume the role of main character Clive Rossfield, and he's not like quite really a prince to the king, but he is of nobility of some sort. In this world, magic is used through the means of these crystals, and only a certain type of human can channel these crystals in order to cast magic. Unfortunately for these individuals, most of this world does not look kindly upon the people who can use the crystals for magic, and they usually become branded. That means that these individuals get like these tattoos, and they kind of become slaves to other non-branded people. And a very select few of these individuals are actually dominants, and they are basically chosen by typical summons that you may recognize from other Final Fantasy games, and they have the actual ability to turn into these summons. In this game, the summons are called icons, but all the typical Final Fantasy summons are here. You got Ifrit, who I've always called Ifrit, but apparently he's pronounced Ifrit. I didn't know that. You got Shiva, Bahamut, Odin, all of these really cool summons that if you've played other Final Fantasy games, you absolutely recognize. And so these dominants can turn into their icons. They can like channel the magic and transform into the icons without use of any crystals. Now in Clive's case, as far as like his family royalty goes, his land doesn't look down upon dominance as much as other nations might. And it turns out that like his bloodline is usually chosen by the Phoenix icon. Unfortunately for Clive, he has not chosen to be the Phoenix icon, but his younger brother is. This game does do a couple of time skips, and so you are seeing their early into the game, their early future, and then we do like this whole time skip in the future, and then we do another time skip in the future. And since this game is relatively new, I am going to be pretty vague in terms of how the story goes. But basically, Clive eventually discovers the ability that he's actually chosen by the icon Ifrit. This means that Clive's main source of magic and attack is going to be fire-based. However, Clive also mysteriously has this ability to almost absorb another dominant's powers. I guess you could say it's kind of Mega Man-esque, where he defeats another dominant and like absorbs his abilities. Or in a more modern sense, maybe you can think of the other Square Enix game, Forspoken. It doesn't mean that he can turn into these other icons, but he can use their source of magic. And so as you progress through the game, you unlock additional spells and abilities that you can cycle through, other than his like fire Ifrit abilities. This lends itself to an interesting progression in terms of the abilities that are available to you, and just keeping the whole gameplay pretty fresh, because it's always exciting when you unlock a whole new aspect of abilities that you can channel. Now, Clive can only have up to 3 of these icons channeled at one time. I think there's a total of 6 or 7 maybe, so you are going to have to pick and choose some favorites. I wouldn't quite say that the combat is Souls-like, where it is super difficult and you have to really get your timing down, but I wouldn't quite call it hack and slash either. It's some blend somewhere in the middle. In terms of difficulty, I wouldn't go as far to call this game difficult, but you do need to be able to time your dodges just right in order to get some good counterattacks and avoid any kind of damage. You do eventually get an icon where you can summon your own shield and parry, but that's probably not your main form of defense. Most of the time you will be just dodging enemy attacks. You're going to want to use your abilities whenever they do come off of cooldown, because your abilities are going to be your main source of damage, your basic attack doesn't really do too much here. Aside from when a certain meter fills up, when you push down on the 2 analog sticks and you kind of get boosted basic attack damage, and then your life will slowly start regenerating. And so that's every once in a while. Once that meter is filled up, then you can channel that mode. I actually really like the combat here, where the only thing that's really holding you back from using your abilities are your cooldowns, and I like being able to like pick and choose different abilities based on what I like and based on my own type of gameplay preferences. And I do like how some of these abilities are just so over the top, explosive, amazing, cool, and you get to use these awesome abilities so frequently, and so it keeps the gameplay fairly exciting. I could see if you are always using like the same 3 different icons, that the gameplay might become a little repetitive once you get the whole combat loop down. But if you are experimenting and constantly trying out all of your new icons and abilities that you are slowly unlocking throughout the game, the gameplay just stays really fresh because you always are getting access to new and exciting abilities. Now, you unlock and upgrade these abilities through a skill tree. It is fairly simple, but basically whenever you finish a combat scenario, you will get ability points that you can then spend on unlocking new abilities and upgrading those abilities. They are also fairly generous in terms of experimentation, because you can refund any of those abilities that you've upgraded or unlocked and then allocate those skill points in other abilities without any kind of repercussions. So it really, really lends itself to trying out all the new abilities whenever you do unlock them and finding the build that works best for you. You're also really going to want to try and build around taking down an enemy stagger bar. Most enemies will have some kind of stagger bar alongside with their HP pool, and basically once they're staggered, then they're not moving, and I think they potentially take additional damage, but I don't know if I ever confirmed that or not. I might have forgotten that detail from the beginning of the game, but yeah, either way, it's really good because they're standing still and you can really wail on them once you deplete that stagger bar. Unlike previous Final Fantasy games that I have played, you are playing as Clive the majority of the game. You're not really switching between party members. Now, you are often accompanied by one or more party members. Most of the time you will be accompanied by the good boy, a wolf named Torgal. And Final Fantasy is no stranger to having good boy dog companions join you on your quest. Torgal is a really, really good boy, although I don't think that he really does too much in terms of like impacting the actual gameplay. You can command him to attack an enemy, slowly heal you, or he can like pin an enemy down, a minor enemy that is. But really, he's kind of just there for emotional support. Like sometimes when you're going through a really difficult castle, like difficult plot-wise that is, it's good to know that he's with you 100% of the way. He's just kind of like always there. One thing that really bugged me is that the characters don't show Torgal enough love as much as they should, at least in my opinion. Now, you do have the ability when you are assuming control of Clive to go up and play with Torgal or pet him, and I tried to do that as many times as possible, but just in terms of like the cinematics, it's like they kind of take Torgal for granted. They definitely need to give that boy some more love. In addition to Torgal, you are often accompanied by another human companion as well. I can't really attest to how much they are affecting the gameplay because it doesn't tell me the numbers of the damage that your companions are doing, but they will help fight. You just don't really get to assume any kind of control on what these characters do. So the basic combat is actually pretty fun, at least in my opinion, but where this game really shines are its boss battles, because the boss battles are so over the top and explosive and exciting. They are very cinematic. That may rub people the wrong way in terms of like just watching these cinematics in the middle of your boss battles. Occasionally you will have these like quick time events where you have to press the square button at the right time, or you have to dodge at the right time. And yeah, it's not very skill-based. It's like just something to make you feel like you have some amount of influence in terms of how these cutscenes go. But they are super exciting, and I love when Clive finally like turns into Ifrit, and he's like taking out another icon, and they just have these huge battles, and that's really the highlight of these games, are those icon battles between these titans. And I will admit, like in between these huge bombastic boss battles, some of the combat can be a little samey. Like sometimes when you're like leading up or working your way down to the next major pivotal point, some of the combat can be just fighting typical knights, and you're walking down hallways. In terms of like the map design, most of the time it is fairly linear, where you are walking down these guided paths. Occasionally you will enter areas that open up a little more like a mini open world, and once you go to like the map selection screen, you can fast travel to all these little mini locations. But other than doing side quests, you don't have too much incentive in order to like explore all these little nooks and crannies. For the most part, unless you're doing side quests, you are just going straight to the next main objective, which is fine. I feel like a game like this really flourishes when it is this single player story driven game. If the pathways are a little more linear and you know exactly where you need to go next. Now, I did mention side quests. At first, you don't really like get a lot of side quests as you play this game. You might get, every time you do like a major story beat, you might get one or two, and it wasn't too bad. It was manageable. So I'm like, okay, well, I can do a couple side quests in between doing all the main objectives. And as this game progresses along, you slowly get more and more side quests available, to the point where the side quests almost become unmanageable. And I will say that the side quests themselves are pretty interesting. They're all voice acted. They all are fairly interesting in terms of like what you're doing and why you're doing it. But there was just too many by the end of the game that I eventually just started skipping all the dialogue and just take me to where I need to go, what enemy I need to fight, what resource I need to collect, and then just skip all of the cutscenes talking to all the NPCs. Oh, thank you for doing that for me, Clive. But yeah, I did do like most of the side quests. It's just by the end of the game, every time I did a main objective, it's like, okay, here's 10 more side quests for you to do. And I'm just like, dude, I'm just gonna skip through all the talking if you don't mind. Like, I'll still do the side quests, but I don't necessarily need to know why unless it's relevant to the main plot. In addition to these side quests, you're also given a bounty board, and I didn't do a lot of the bounty board, but basically the idea is they put up a wanted poster like, here's an extra strong enemy at this location, go and kill them. My main gripe with the bounty boards is it doesn't give you a waypoint exactly where that enemy is, and so you kind of have to like read the map and look at where they are. And like, granted, it's not like that big of a deal. You probably could just Google, hey, where is the Bomb King, and they'll tell you like exactly where on the map it is. But that's just like an extra step too far that I'm not willing to do. So unless you're gonna give me like a waypoint on where it is, I'm probably not going to seek out these enemies unless I just run into them naturally. So yeah, did most of the side quests, didn't do very many of the wanted posters. When you do the side quests, you do get a resource, and then when you hit certain tiers with your resource, then you'll get items, but it wasn't absolutely necessary. And so if you wanted to just go into this game like, I'm just going to do the main objective, just ignore all of the side content, I don't feel like you would be punished that much. The only reason that I felt inclined to do these side quests is because by the end of the game, I was fairly invested in terms of my character growth and trying to upgrade all of my really strong abilities. Which is actually a high praise coming from me, because I typically, for these type of games, like, don't really care about doing all the side content. Usually I am the type of player that will just go straight for the main objective and ignore the side content if I can get away with it. In addition to side quests and bounties, you do have this like central hub that you go to after doing main objectives, and this is where you're going to do your shopping, and you have a blacksmith that you can use your resources that you collected out in the field to to buy new gear and upgrade that gear. For the most part, I did have all of the resources that I needed, except for the super rare yellow colored gear at the end of the game. And I think you really had to go out of your way to finally get like those ultimate weapons, which I didn't do. But yeah, for most of the game, I was able to buy all of the new gear from the blacksmith because I would have all of those resources. One feature that's actually kind of cool about your main hub is you have this almost jukebox thing, and you can acquire new music as you play through the game. And once you toggle that on, anytime you go to your main hub, it will play that music that you want. So it's kind of cool because you find like that one song that you really like, and whenever you get to go to the main hub, it will play that main song in the overworld. You know, I heard somewhere, I don't know if it was a podcast or a game, that this game was heavily inspired by Game of Thrones. And if that's true, I really do believe it, because Clive is very much a Jon Snow-esque character. He's kind of like the reject in his family because he wasn't chosen by the Phoenix, and he's accompanied by this giant wolf. And I mean, he wouldn't be a Final Fantasy protagonist if he wasn't a stoic, super serious man. That's not fair. There are Final Fantasy protagonists that don't fit that stereotype. But yeah, for the most part, you are playing like the Cloud or the Squall type characters where you're super serious and quiet. I'm not saying that like Clive is a super angsty and angry character like Cloud or Squall, but he definitely is the stoic, sad type. And as you play through the game, you definitely understand why. Again, I'm being fairly cryptic in terms of how the story plays out, but it is pretty grim and sometimes pretty bloody. I mean, really, like the whole world that you're living in is slowly getting destroyed by this corruption. And so the land around you is becoming destroyed, and resources and actual livable land is becoming very scarce. A bunch of nations are at war for that remaining livable land. And so it is a pretty grim world that Clive is living in. I do like how they flip the stereotypical Final Fantasy setting over in terms of like the crystals, because if you've ever played a Final Fantasy game before, they focus very much on crystals, in that like the crystals are the source of all that is right and holy. And usually in Final Fantasy games, you're trying to protect crystals or purify crystals. Like, crystals are a form of reverence, and in this game you're actually trying to destroy the crystals. And so you're kind of seen as this bad guy outlaw. Like, you have a good reason on why you're destroying the crystals, but it's kind of fun how they flip that stereotype on its head. Oh, and if you are a Final Fantasy fan, I think you're gonna get a lot out of this game, not only for the icons and the crystals, but also just for the music, because there are moments when they play old Final Fantasy songs and it just hits so hard. Like, they play the typical main theme for Final Fantasy at these like reverent moments, and you're just hit right there in the feels. Or they play that one song for the very first Final Fantasy game when like the bridge gets restored and your party sets out, and it's just so incredibly nostalgic when they play that music. But yeah, seeing these summons in this new modern version is also really satisfying. Like, Ifrit, you see Ifrit in pretty much like every Final Fantasy game, but like actually playing as him and using his Hellfire spell, it is just so cool. And it really gives you like a respect for all of these other summons. Like Odin is so crazy powerful. Like, his whole summon, the thing is that he has a chance to one-hit KO enemies when you summon him in other Final Fantasy games, and how it's represented in this game is just so awesome. Just that like awesome sword that can just slice enemies with one hit. And like Bahamut, he's all about like, he's this really cool dragon that can do all these crazy laser beams, and just how it's depicted in this game is so awesome. This game took me 35 5-ish hours to beat, which is actually fairly short for a Final Fantasy game. And I will admit, there are some slow moments here. There's some slower story beats that probably could have been written out, and this would have been a really great 25-30 hour game. But if you don't mind the combat, and if you really like the characters, then even the slow moments aren't too bad. Another low point for some might be its massive cinematics and cutscenes. Like, sometimes you're sitting there for about 5 minutes not doing anything. You're just watching a bunch of events unfold, and that can be a real down point for some people. For me personally, I usually don't mind the longer cinematics and cutscenes as long as they are interesting, and for the most part they are pretty interesting. Like, all of the dominants, these are like the bosses that you typically take on as you play through the game. All of the dominants have their own kind of desires and plot lines, and so you're watching all of their stories unfold as well as Clive's. And I was fairly invested in terms of like how all the characters are. The main antagonist in this game is this really creepy guy named Ultima, and if you've ever played any Final Fantasy games, you know Ultima is like usually the strongest spell that you can use in the game. In this game, he is personified in this weird, almost alien looking thing with like 4 arms, and he talks really robotic, and I like him as a character. He's very mysterious and daunting. Like, you could definitely do worse in terms of the big bad for a video game. Overall, I actually really liked this game. I don't think it's perfect. I do think there are moments that are a little slower. I do think that sometimes you can get overwhelmed with side quests, but I mean, I do think I am going to give this game a 5 out of 5. That's why I call a 5 out of 5 amazing and not perfect, is because there is room for flaws here, but just in terms of like my overall experience, this is probably my favorite Final Fantasy game to date. I don't know if that's like controversial or not, because I know a lot of people have a lot of respect for like Final Fantasy VII, or there's a lot of love for Final Fantasy X, but for me personally, yeah, this is probably my favorite one, just in terms of like the whole package here. That being said though, I have not yet played through Final Fantasy 9, 11, 13, and 14. Now, 11 and 14, they're MMOs, so I'm probably never going to play through those, but I don't know, maybe 9 or 13 will be really amazing. But yeah, like as of right now, as of all the other ones that I played, I think this is my favorite one. Well, guys, that's it for me. Let me know if you have any questions or comments about Final Fantasy XVI, and I'd love to hear what you have to say. Otherwise, I'll talk to you later. Bye!
Why, the beast has the appetite of a behemoth. Just this very morn, I found him with his nose buried in my nuts.